Victoria, the royal who invented the modern monarchy. Queen who made Britain an empire.
Victoria's Britain is ruling the waves, ruling the world.
But who was the real woman beneath the crown? In this series, we discover Victoria as we've never seen her before. A sensuous young queen.
He clasped me in his arms, and we kissed each other, again and again.
A reluctant mother of 9.
Victoria definitely didn't like babies. Almost grosses her out to see her own children.
A devastated widow.
She was suicidal, absolutely. She was inconsolable.
And a passionate wife.
It's not Victoria the Virgin, it's the Victoria the hot mama.
Using remarkable archive treasures, and through her own words in journals and diaries, we tell the story of a complex, very human queen.
Those tiny seconds of moving film, they completely change how we see this monarch.
This is really exciting new evidence about Victoria. We think we know everything, but we don't.
In this programme, the youngest monarch for 290 years becomes a wife.
They stayed up all night on the wedding night. She did not get any sleep, and she said it in her journal, and why would she?
But soon struggles to balance life as a wife, a mother, and a monarch.
This is a marriage that has a central fault line running through it. She is the queen. She is the boss. Albert is not the king. He's simply her bloke, her husband.
This is the private life of Queen Victoria.
Monday, 10th of February. The last time that I slept alone.
London, 1840. Inside Buckingham Palace, the 20-year-old Queen Victoria is hours away from her wedding. A ruling queen hasn't got married in England for nearly 300 years. And she's feeling the nerves.
All brides, of course, wake up nervous, excited on their wedding day. But can you imagine Victoria waking up in this palace over here? She can hear the crowds already assembling, and she's waking up and knowing that this is her wedding day and that she's the star.
Just 2 years earlier, those crowds were roaring for Victoria's coronation. But that day, she'd been a queen. Today, she was determined to be something else. A wife.
Albert is so excessively handsome. My heart is quite going.
Victoria's husband-to-be is her German cousin, Prince Albert.
Victoria is super in love with Albert. She's super in love because, of course, she hardly knows him. They have got engaged within a few weeks and married a few weeks after that. It's like a girl who gets her first boyfriend and just thinks, this is amazing. We can't underestimate just the simple kind of leap of hormones.
Besides butterflies over the ceremony, Victoria has another reason to be nervous.
Up till now, royal weddings have tended to take place in a palace, often in the evening, always behind closed doors. There was no public involvement. But Victoria's wedding is different.
The crowds were enormous right here outside Buckingham Palace. All of the trees in this area, people were scrambling to get a better view by climbing up them. People really wanted to see what the Queen looked like, what she was wearing for her wedding.
At her coronation, Victoria wore heavy royal robes. But today, she's a wife, and that meant a very different outfit.
At 12:30, I set off. I wore a white satin gown.
To modernise, Victoria looks a bit like a standard bride. You know, she's wearing a white dress, but actually what she was wearing was really surprising.
She's making a statement, and the point is this. She wants to be married as a woman and not as a monarch.
White itself, although we see it as a symbol of purity, actually in the time it was more of wealth, because you had to be rich enough to clean a white dress, which obviously Victoria was. And it was publicised everywhere. It was in all the papers. People copied it. Victoria is the reason why people wear white dresses to their weddings today.
As the royal carriage set off from the palace, Victoria was overjoyed by the welcome she got from the public.
I never saw such crowds of people as there were in the park, and they cheered most enthusiastically.
We're all used to Harry and Meghan, Kate and Wills, earlier Charles and Diana. They're big events, people celebrate. But that wasn't the case before Victoria. This was the very first big public royal wedding.
Just before 1 o'clock, the bride arrived at St. James's Palace.
I entered the chapel. At the altar, to my right, stood my precious angel.
By now, the congregation could see the bride close up.
Victoria prided herself on being able to suppress her emotions and not show what she was feeling, but every orange flower in her hair was quivering, and she had red eyes as though she hadn't slept. So it's really clear that Victoria was feeling anxious and nervous on her big day.
Victoria's feelings can't have been helped by the wedding vows she was about to make, which had the congregation on the edge of their seats.
The big question that everybody wondered when they watched Victoria walk up the aisle, is she going to swear to obey her husband or not?
The obey question is really a question about power. It's about who is actually in charge. She is the monarch. She's meant to be the top of the totem pole, the top of the tree. Nobody is supposed to have power over her.
The promise of marital obedience was a key part of the Victorian wedding service. A woman would make the vow. But would a queen?
Everyone was waiting with bated breath to see what the vows would actually contain. And here they are. This is what the Archbishop of Canterbury said to Victoria. Wilt thou obey him and serve him, love, honour and keep him, so long as ye both shall live? Her Majesty looked up affectionately into Prince Albert's face and replied, loud enough to be heard in every part of the chapel, I will. So it was emphatic. She almost shouted these words. She wanted everyone to hear, and they did. Queen Victoria had promised to obey Prince Albert.
In promising to obey her husband, Victoria was trying to build the secure, happy family she'd been denied as a child.
She wanted to obey Albert because she wanted to be in all ways a wife to him. Just for that moment in that ceremony, she wanted to be 100% the little girl now made into a wife that she'd dreamed about.
But how easy would the young queen find it to obey her husband? After a long day on public display, the couple arrived at Windsor Castle. Victoria's finally alone with her new husband.
She was completely beside herself, very excited. Very excited both for the wedding day and the wedding night, I think. I think she'd been thinking quite a lot about that and was very happy to finally be there.
I never spent such an evening. He clasped me in his arms and we kissed each other again and again.
Victoria is, I think it's fair to say, bowled over by the whole concept of sex. She is so very up for it that it is impossible to say quite how much.
When day dawned, for we did not sleep much, and I beheld that beautiful, angelic face by my side, it was more than I can express. He does look so beautiful in his shirt only, with his beautiful throat seen.
They stayed up all night on the wedding night. She did not get any sleep, and she said it in her journal, and why would she?
To lie by his side and in his arms and on his dear bosom, and be called by names of tenderness I have never yet heard used to me before, was bliss beyond belief.
There's a scene where she talks of Albert helping her to put her stockings on in the morning, stockings which at that point would have been held up by ties. So really a very intimate moment indeed. I mean, let's face it, if a man is in your giggle zone, because when you get that far, you're laughing, then really that is a relationship which is all about lust.
With her new man on her arm, Victoria wanted to dress to impress, and she loved a party.
In the early 1840s, Victoria was a tiny person. Not only was she very short, she was about 5 foot, 5'1". She also had a tiny waist, and so these large flouncing silhouettes were very important to her as a way of kind of taking up space and getting attention. This dress is a reproduction of the kind of dress that Victoria was wearing in the very early years of her marriage for balls, court events, and other formal occasions. It is wonderfully made. It was a balance for her between her great love of food and excess, but also her love of appearing in this very controlled, contained body. And she took great pains to keep that hourglass silhouette.
But although he was always by her side, Albert wasn't quite as much of a party animal as his young wife.
Albert was a bit more quiet, a bit more bookish, and was less excited about the parties. But Victoria was very much in charge of both the country and the marriage. So Victoria got what she wanted, ultimately, and that was the parties.
It wasn't just the couple's social life where Victoria was laying down the law. When Albert discovered they were only to get 3 days for their honeymoon, he asked Victoria for a longer break. She soon put him in his place.
You forget, my dearest love, that I am the sovereign, and that business can stop and wait for nothing. It is quite impossible for me to be absent from London.
And she's quite patronising at that point. It's as if she's explained, you know, look, darling, Mum is really quite busy. Mummy's got important work to do, so I'm afraid that's not going to happen.
Victoria had always been someone who was very stubborn. She was very determined to have her way.
As a royal prince, Albert expected status and power in his marriage. He complained, "I am only the husband and not the master of the house."
Right from the beginning of the marriage, obey was always going to be an issue. Victoria was incredibly status conscious, and so to suddenly have someone else, someone she barely knew, let's face it, they'd only met 3 times, saying to her, no, I want this, I want that, I demand a longer honeymoon. I mean, no way, please.
And this is a marriage that has a central fault line running through it from the start, and it's basically this: she is the queen, she is the boss. Albert is not the king, he's simply her bloke, her husband. I mean, Albert wonders what on earth he's there, what is he there for?
Before long, early cracks begin to show, as Albert wonders whether the marriage is so perfect after all. Four months into her marriage, Victoria is happier than she's ever been. She's 21 and madly in love. And for the British public, the young monarch is a breath of fresh air.
The monarchs preceding her, her family, her relatives, they are debauched, they are immoral, they have illegitimate children scattered everywhere. The British public had really lost faith in the monarchy. They'd lost support. It was something that was satirised. It was something that people really took the mickey out of. Victoria really changes that. She challenges it, and she seems to make it her mission to make the royal family respectable again.
Victoria's marriage to Albert gave the royal family a desperately needed kick-start.
In many ways, Victoria's wedding day is actually more important than her coronation, because the wedding means that she is going to start a succession.
And Britain didn't have to wait long for the patter of tiny feet. By summer 1840, less than 4 months after the wedding, news was already sweeping the country that Victoria was pregnant. Her public were over the moon.
She was very popular. She's making herself very available to her public, attending parties, but also just riding her carriage open top around London.
Victoria wanted to get close to her people, but it was risky behaviour.
We're used to royals being incredibly well guarded, but it just wasn't like that in Victoria's reign. She made a point of trying to show that she trusted her people and the population.
At around 6 p.m. on Wednesday, the 10th of June, Victoria and Albert left for their daily open-topped carriage ride around Hyde Park.
I was deafened by the loud report of a pistol. We looked round and saw a little man on the footpath, a pistol in each hand.
The would-be assassin was a man called Edward Oxford, who was an unemployed labourer. He gets the opportunity for a second shot. Fortunately, he doesn't manage to shoot her. Commotion breaks out, he's wrestled to the ground, Albert steps in, and this is a really dangerous moment.
Albert turned towards me, squeezing my hand, exclaiming, "My God, don't be alarmed." I assured him I was not the least frightened.
Edward Oxford was bundled to the ground, arrested, and later declared insane. To the public, Victoria and Albert were now heroes.
People of Great Britain, when they read of the calmness and dignity of their sovereign at so trying a moment, will regard her with admiration and love and repose even more confidence in her than they have yet done. So the assassination attempts really show us the kind of young woman that Queen Victoria was. She was brave. She made a great show of always still going out for her drives in public and not increasing her guard, and the people really respected her for it.
She was still in her early 20s, but Victoria had proved she was fearless and loved by her people. But how would she cope with a very different role? After the assassination attempt, the public were even more excited about the upcoming birth. But inside palace walls, there was one person who wasn't at all happy about the pregnancy.
I'm really upset about it, and it is spoiling my happiness.
Victoria fired off angry letters to relatives, revealing how the news had ruined her blissful marriage.
I have always hated the idea. I cannot understand how anyone can wish for such a thing, especially at the beginning of a marriage.
She wanted time to enjoy her beautiful new husband. She wanted time to have a lot of energetic sex and to party and to generally behave like a married woman, which gave her a certain status, but also someone who was young and up for it.
As the due date got closer, the palace doctors made detailed plans. 180 years on, at the Royal College of Physicians in London, one of the doctor's diaries still survives. It was only published in 2016. And it offers a remarkable insight. For Victoria, there was no such thing as a private birth.
Robert Ferguson's diary really takes us behind the scenes. It takes us into a place where none of the public could go. The Queen is in her room, which is at the end of a long chain of interconnecting rooms with double doors. And right at the other end of the chain, you have the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the Archbishop of Canterbury, all waiting in that room. And the point here is that the Queen does not want to see these old men watching her in childbirth. And I mean, who would? You can't blame her. I think no mother today can imagine this happening. A room full of sort of, imagine you'd have Boris in there.
The doctors rigged up a makeshift screen to give the mum-to-be at least a little bit of privacy.
At last, Her Majesty's bedroom door was flung open. The ministers could see the actual bed, though not Her Majesty, for a screen was elevated in that half of the footboard of the bed on which she lay.
Throughout her pregnancy, Victoria had prayed for a son.
After a good many hours suffering, a perfect little child was born at 2 in the afternoon. But alas, a girl, and not a boy.
Ferguson writes, "The very first words which I heard were from the Queen. I fear it will create great disappointment." Having a baby, even though it's a very healthy girl, none of that was enough. It's really rather sad that she felt that she hadn't, a great disappointment. But Victoria then said, "Never mind, I expect the next one will be a boy."
Despite her disappointment, Victoria had made history. She was the first ruling monarch ever to give birth in England. Already balancing the duties of wife and queen, Victoria now had a new role that she'd find far harder than both of these. Victoria was a new mum, but she also had new staff to help.
Aristocratic or royal parents weren't expected to do the day-to-day care for their children. There would be a complete staff of servants for the nursery, so there were nursemaids, nannies. The baby was never alone. The nursery would be close to Victoria and Albert. It was often on a different floor to them, often the floor above. They could access the children whenever they wanted to, but they didn't do the day-to-day care.
Which may have been just as well, as for Victoria, motherhood didn't always come naturally, as she revealed in brutally honest letters.
An ugly baby is a very nasty object, and the prettiest is frightful when undressed. That terrible frog-like action.
For new mothers, Victoria's words were just as harsh.
I think much more of our being like a cow or a dog at such moments.
So she had a wet nurse for the baby. It was a woman who'd obviously had their own baby and was still able to nurse. They would move into the nursery and take the majority of the care of the royal infant as soon as they were born.
But if Victoria had her bad days as a new mum, she also found real pleasure in her baby daughter, who she named after herself, though the little girl was always known as Vicky.
This was drawn by Queen Victoria, and it is a picture of her baby. So her eldest child, Princess Vicky, it's such a beautiful image. You get a real sense that Victoria knew this child intimately. This is a mother who's clearly besotted with her child and wants to record an image of her child looking particularly cute but particularly lovely, as modern parents do with cameras. It's so clear that it was drawn from a place of love.
I think it's unfair to tar Victoria completely with the brush of being a bad mother. Yes, she did openly say that she disliked babies. She also wrote letters praising her children, loving her children, saying how cute she found babies to be. In many ways, she was just human. At one point, she wanted to strangle her children. At another point, she wanted to sweep them all up into her arms and protect them from the world.
Just 1 year after her daughter, Victoria gave birth to the son and heir she'd always wanted.
At last, at 12 minutes to 11, I gave birth to a fine, large boy. Oh, how happy, how grateful did I feel.
Prince Edward was a healthy, bouncing baby. He was given the affectionate name Bertie. But Victoria's happiness didn't last. For decades, historians didn't know what happened next. But now, a remarkable piece of evidence tells the full, shocking story. 3 weeks after Bertie was born, Royal Doctor Robert Ferguson was summoned to see not the baby, but the mother. His diary, which lay hidden for over a century, reveals why.
Ferguson writes, she, that's Victoria, had been gloomy and desponding. There were illusions both of the eye and the ear. By the one sense, she was deceived into a belief that she saw spots on people's faces, which turned into worms, and that coffins floated before her. This is the most extraordinary piece of new material about Queen Victoria, because what's being described here is hallucinations. The worms on people's faces, the coffins floating before the Queen. I mean, it must have been truly terrifying.
During his visit, Ferguson spoke to a worried Albert.
His face close to mine, and with pale and haggard looks, he broke out. "The Queen has heard that you have paid much attention to mental disease and is afraid that she is about to lose her mind."
Then Ferguson met Victoria herself in her bedroom.
She was lying down, and the tears were flowing fast over her cheek as she addressed me, overwhelmed with shame at the necessity of confessing her weaknesses, and impelled by the very burden of her mind and her sorrows to seek relief. This is really exciting new evidence about Victoria. We think we know everything, but we don't. The intensity of Victoria's hallucinations and this terrible fear that she's losing her mind, this really suggests that Victoria's life at this time is really much darker than we ever knew. And certainly nobody at the time knew this. It was kept a very close secret.
Victoria's state of mind brought back a fear that haunted the royal family.
She was the granddaughter of George III, and he is Britain's mad king. He spent the last few decades of his life unable to rule at all.
There's a real worry that perhaps Victoria has inherited that as a sort of taint, that there is something rotten at the heart of this family, that it's bad blood and that it's going to come out.
As she struggled with parenthood, Victoria found being mother, wife, and queen quite hard to manage. For now, she's grateful to her supportive husband. Albert, however, decides to make a bid for power. By her 23rd birthday, Victoria was a wife and a mother of 2. But she was also queen of one of the most powerful nations on earth, with an empire rapidly circling the globe. Britain needed a strong government, and that meant a dedicated Victoria.
As Queen, Victoria was very, very busy. She would expect to meet with her Prime Minister. Papers requiring her signature arrived daily. She would receive government boxes setting out policy, asking her to look over documents, perhaps amend them. Victoria very much did have political power.
Although her workload was large, Victoria had no intention of sharing any of her royal duties with her husband.
Albert very much had other ideas, and right from the start of their marriage was pushing for more access. He wanted to see what was in the government boxes. He wanted to be consulted on government policy. He wanted to help direct the way that the country was going.
At first, Victoria kept Albert well away from her day job, but gradually she began to relent.
Once Victoria gives birth and goes on giving birth, it becomes impossible, even for as hard a worker as she. She has to hand over stuff to Albert.
Albert was obviously incredibly ambitious, but that was matched by his drive for hard work. He would be up before Victoria and he would work later, and he would work and work and work.
At first she finds it incredibly difficult to give away power and control. But actually, once you start realising that actually if I have this very competent, extremely hard-working person by my side, it's like waiting to exhale. Maybe there's a point at which she kind of goes, oh, I don't have to do everything. Maybe I can share.
Grateful for the help, Victoria falls even more in love with her new husband.
His love and gentleness is beyond everything. Oh, was ever woman so blessed as I am?
But Albert wasn't the only person by Victoria's side. One figure from her past was still a huge part of her life. And soon Victoria would have to choose between them. Victoria had had a troubled childhood spent at Kensington Palace. Her mother had raised her under an incredibly strict regime, but one person had protected the young princess, her German governess, Louise Lesen. She'd taken care of Victoria since she was 5 years old.
Lesen had always been the one person more than anybody else in Victoria's corner, and Victoria knew that and had so much trust in her and respect for her opinion.
Now a married woman, Victoria was still incredibly close to her childhood governess, as a remarkable record at Kensington Palace reveals.
This is an incredibly exciting document. It's a scrapbook kept by Louise Lesen. I'm looking here, this is extraordinary, at a bit of Victoria's silken wedding dress, which Leeson has very carefully cut out and kept. And look, here's a bit of the bouquet, pressed flowers. What we've got here are snippets of hair that Leeson collected throughout her time with Victoria. Here we've got some locks from really early on, and they're very light brown, almost blonde. Also, the hair, very, very scanty. This is baby hair, very fine. And then under here, it's a solid dark mid-brown. Here we've got a really lovely, luscious lock. Victoria was always quite proud about her hair. That was believed to be one of her finer features. It just shows how much access Leeson had at this time. She, after all, not many people are able to, in effect, snip bits off the Queen's wedding dress.
Albert was jealous of Leeson's influence over his wife.
Leeson was the person above all else that she listened to, and Albert wanted to be that person.
Albert has come to realise that if he is to establish an ascendancy within the household, he has to get rid of Leeson.
Victoria had put Leeson in charge of the royal nursery. Shortly afterwards, Princess Vicky became seriously ill.
She's getting thinner and thinner, and the young parents are, as you can imagine, any young parents would be, incredibly distraught. Albert's concern is that Leeson is not supervising the children properly, and that Vicky may well die.
On January the 16th, 1842, in the royal nursery, the simmering tensions finally exploded. Furious with Leeson's regime, Albert attacked the way his daughter had been treated. But loyal to Leeson, Victoria flew into a rage.
It becomes a huge row between Albert and Victoria. They both accuse the other one of wanting to kill the baby.
Albert wrote seething letters. Leeson was a crazy plotter with a lust for power, who was endangering the life of his child. Then he refuses to speak to his wife.
Then Albert won't talk to her for days. And she writes pathetic letters saying, please, please, forgive me, and I know I've done wrong, and apologising. You never get an apology from Albert, I don't think.
Sensing Victoria's weakness, Albert saw his chance. Without telling his wife, he sacked Leeson. For the Queen, it was a hard choice, her lifelong friend or her husband.
Victoria picked Albert. He fired Leeson without her permission, and she permitted that.
In the battle over her oldest friend, the wife had obeyed her husband.
She was a bit backed into a corner. It's harder to fire your husband than your governess. But that does speak to how much she was willing to concede to him.
The battle with her husband showed another Victoria, not the commanding queen, but the vulnerable young woman, exhausted by the demands of motherhood and monarchy, and willing, even eager, to let someone else be in charge. Outside the palace walls, by the 1840s, Victoria's nation was changing fast.
This was the great railway age, so the railway terminuses were being built in London, people were pouring in, the suburbs were developing. London was an enormous city, one of the biggest cities in the world, and certainly at this point in the 1840s it was growing faster than ever before.
And it wasn't just London that was getting overcrowded. In less than 2 years, Victoria had her third and fourth children. And she was feeling the pressure.
She didn't have that sense of privacy that other people have, because she was almost never alone. She was almost never allowed to be alone. You can take the crown off, but you're never not the queen.
Victoria could see her duties as monarch and mother were putting her marriage under increasing pressure. She was desperately looking for a way to rebuild the relationship. And in 1842, she found it. That year, she and Albert made their first trip to the Scottish Highlands. And for the second time in her life, Victoria fell in love.
We took a most beautiful drive, a long part of the lake and between the mountains. A really delightful country.
2 years later, they borrowed a Scottish castle for a return trip. Blair Castle still houses letters and documents, many never seen by the public. They reveal how, although it was a romantic getaway, Victoria and Albert didn't exactly travel light.
This housebook lists the royal party, and it starts with Her Majesty, His Royal Highness Prince Albert. It then goes on to mention the staff that travelled with them. For example, a nursery maid, a hairdresser, a pastry cook, a confectioner, 2 messengers, 11 footmen, 1 roasting cook. We have a baker, an upholsterer, and a table decker. So there was a huge amount of staff actually travelled with them.
The staff at Blair Castle had rushed to make it fit for a queen, including brand new furniture.
So this is Queen Victoria's bed. It is carved in the French style, beautifully carved with crimson silk damask ends and headboard. This was a brand new bed for Queen Victoria, commissioned in a very, very short time.
After a good rest, Victoria was up for breakfast at 8:30. At the time, most rural Scots lived on a simple potato or oat-based diet. For Victoria's meals, Blair Castle laid on something a bit more special.
This housebook lists all the food that was eaten, what was drunk when the royal party were here. For example, we have 31 stone of beef, 26 stone of mutton, we have butter, milk and cream, garden vegetables, and we have 7 stone of venison. There was drinks such as sherry, port, whiskey and stout. And all of these items would have had to have been collected in before the royal party visited.
When she bought her own Scottish castle, Balmoral, Victoria found a way to have her cake and eat it.
At Balmoral, things still came up from Windsor Castle, so big baskets of things like pies and biscuits and cakes, things that were transportable, would come up by train from Windsor.
Scotland gave Victoria and Albert a chance to spend time together.
We took a delightful walk of 2 hours. Through the wood, along a steep, winding path overhanging the rapid stream, full of stones and clear as glass.
Victoria was always very adventurous. One of the things she found charming about Scotland was this idea that it was an unspoilt wilderness where she could wander off.
Unusually for Victoria and Albert, they could wander almost alone.
At 9 o'clock, we set off on ponies to go up one of the hills. Attended only by Lord Glenlyon's excellent servant, Sandy Macara, in his Highland dress. The most delightful, most romantic ride and walk I ever had.
After their fights in London, in Scotland, Victoria fell in love with Albert all over again.
Dearest Albert, so delighted with everything, and in high spirits. It is a pleasure to see him.
Victoria was a wife again, because for once she could forget about being a queen. But as she made small steps away from the spotlight, her husband headed towards it. And soon, Victoria would find herself fighting for her crown. By the age of 29, Victoria had 5 children. Since becoming queen, she'd lived at Buckingham Palace. But as her family grew, she was getting itchy feet.
Buckingham Palace, right in the middle of London, was not seen as being very private. There were tremendous issues with the public breaking in or with noise. There weren't really any good sewer systems in the streets surrounding Buckingham Palace. What happened when the palace was built was it was kind of built on top of a sewer, but no one quite realised that. So every time it rained, that particular sewer, which ran under the kitchens, would flood. It was just awful. The courtyard would flood. There'd be turds bobbing up and down in puddles.
It is crowded, it is dirty, it smells terrible. The air in the morning is full of brewing and of tanning, and these are sulphurous, horrible, rotten, eggy smells. It's terrible, and you can't escape it anywhere. So it's not somewhere that is healthy for really anyone, but especially not if you have a young family like Victoria does.
Borrowing castles in Scotland was one thing. Now Victoria wanted a new house of her own. Osborne House on the Isle of Wight was Victoria's dream home. She and Albert bought the estate for £28,000, or £2.2 million in today's money, and built an Italian-style villa.
Victoria, she's very, very keen on the idea of coming to the Isle of Wight. She wants somewhere, honestly, where she can have Albert with her all the time, because Albert has been bustling around all over the country. He's never at home.
By royal standards, Osborne House was a modest affair.
The kitchen was much, much smaller than the kitchens elsewhere, so too were the staffing arrangements. There were usually about 11 cooks at Osborne House, as opposed to the 45 that you would have back at Windsor. The meals as well, they were much more scaled down versions of the ones that people would have eaten at Windsor. There were no huge state banquets, there were no massive balls. This was very much a sort of private palace for small-scale entertaining and for living like a family.
At Osborne, Victoria initially tried to make time for the children. There was swimming in the sea, a military fort, and even a replica Swiss cottage in which to play. It soon became one of Victoria's favourite residences.
We are so thankful for this beautiful seaside home and all the pleasures of the country. It is really a paradise.
But despite what Victoria wrote, behind the scenes, the family home wasn't as ideal as it seemed. In fact, there was trouble in paradise.
Of course, for Victoria, it was lovely, it was cosy, it was domestic. It could only be all those things because, of course, she had a vast retinue who had to come with her. That's not just cooks and pages, but also the ladies-in-waiting, ladies of the court, who have to come with her. And they hated it because it's so dull. I mean, it's an island. They can't get off it easily, and they're not allowed to anyway. And, you know, being cosy with your family is all very well when it's your family. When it's somebody else's family, it's like being trapped in the most awful kind of soap opera.
For the royals too, life was far from the perfect image they tried to project. The headstrong Victoria could be impatient with her older children and often struggled to find anything in common with them.
I find no especial pleasure or compensation in the company of the older children.
She never comes across as the more involved parent. It's often Albert driving the relationship with the children.
Albert plays with the children a lot. You know, he's always on all fours pretending to be a horse or whatever it might be.
She wasn't a natural mother because she'd never been properly mothered herself, we would say now. She didn't know what it was to be mothered, so how on earth could she kind of work out how to do it herself? Albert seems to have a natural skill, so she's very happy to pass over a lot of the mothering to him.
But the amount of time Albert spent with his children caused problems.
With Victoria, her eldest daughter, Vicky is obviously very intelligent and bright, just like her father. And Victoria herself is very proud of that. But then again, there's this element of jealousy that, oh, my daughter's stealing my husband away and, you know, they're close and I'm not.
I often grudged you children being always there, when I longed to be alone with dearest Papa. Those are always my happiest moments.
Victoria resented her children for taking away her husband. The grudge, like the family, kept getting bigger. By the age of 31, Victoria had 7 children. But it wasn't just her husband the children were keeping her from.
For Victoria, the discomfort of this constant childbearing is made worse She resents it because part of her feels that really what she ought to be doing is making the decisions and reading the documents and meeting the politicians. That's her vocation. That's what she was born to do. And she can't do that because of this constant pregnancy and this constant sort of feeling unwell.
With his wife often exhausted, the workaholic Albert was only too happy to take up the slack. And as the months pass, he takes on more and more. Soon he's not just assisting Victoria, but dealing with politicians himself.
We can almost see a co-monarchy arising where Albert took increasing control, and the idea of consulting Victoria without Albert became increasingly unlikely.
Up till now, Albert has mostly worked in Victoria's shadow. But after the birth of the couple's 7th child, he felt confident enough to step onto the national stage. On May the 1st, 1851, London's Hyde Park saw a spectacular sight. The Great Exhibition was a vast celebration of Victorian innovation and technology.
The Great Exhibition, a huge flat-pack glass cathedral, full of kind of commercial objects, you know, things being demonstrated, materials from all over the empire.
Over 6 million visitors attended. The exhibition was living proof that Victorian Britain was the greatest nation on earth, and the mastermind behind it was Prince Albert.
It's his show, the Great Exhibition. When Victoria comes, she's a visitor. She is honoured there, but it's not her gig.
Victoria declared how proud she was of her husband.
This day is one of the greatest and most glorious days of our lives. God bless my dearest Albert and my dear country, which has shown itself so great today.
But although Victoria cut the ribbon, there was only one star of the show.
It's not going too far to say that the Great Exhibition was the defining moment of Albert's life. He became Britain's prince, almost a co-ruler. So after the Great Exhibition, it's Albert, finally, who's in the spotlight, and it's Victoria who's in his shadow.
As her husband's power and success grew, Victoria suffered a crisis of confidence. Just 4 months after the exhibition closed its doors, the once confident young queen even began to doubt her right to rule.
I am every day more convinced that we women, if we are to be good women, feminine and amiable and domestic, are not fitted to reign.
This is a woman who's gone from being, I'm the queen of the castle, what I say goes, to doubting herself completely. I think it probably tells you the kind of struggle that's going on within herself, because buried somewhere in there is the woman who knows that she is queen. But all her plans to rule as a sovereign while Albert, in effect, is the little woman at home, that's all gone by the wayside.
She's constantly trying to find a solution to what her position should be. For many years, that solution was to be a mother and have a lot of children, but that left her feeling resentful that she was excluded. And yet when she tries to return to any sort of position of power, she keeps coming up against Albert. So she's trapped, Victoria. And the result is that the tempers and the tantrums and the difficult times get more common.
Soon, those tantrums turn to open war, and the perfect marriage nears meltdown. At 33 years old, Queen Victoria became pregnant with her 8th child. For the earlier births, she'd suffered pain and depression, but now, a medical breakthrough offered to take the pain away.
Chloroform was a new drug, and it gave pain relief during childbirth. You might think that that was a sort of no-brainer that everybody would support, but that was not the case.
Some religious figures claimed the Bible said women had to suffer during labour, while some doctors were concerned that chloroform was dangerous and potentially fatal. But despite the risks, Victoria chose to have it.
At 1:15, a boy was born to great happiness to me. Dr. Snow administered that blessed chloroform, and the effect was soothing, quieting and delightful beyond measure.
You can see a certain stubbornness and willfulness, but, she'd made up her mind, and as it turned out, she was right.
The impact of Victoria's decision went way beyond the palace.
It meant that chloroform and pain relief in pregnancy became socially acceptable, and it was used quite widely. And this, in a sense, was Victoria doing something for women.
But if the birth had been smooth, the weeks that followed were rocky. Victoria's postnatal illness returned, as did screaming rows with Albert.
It was absolutely flaming on some occasions. They would be ferocious, screaming fits, at the peak of which he would rush from the room and she would rush from the room.
We have to imagine Victoria pursuing Albert down the corridor, Albert retreating into his room, and while she is on one side of the door, him, writing her a serious letter about how she was at fault, which she would then receive and agree with.
Victoria's response to these letters is always to submit and to blame herself and to apologise and to describe her weaknesses and her failings. Victoria kept a record of her bad behaviour, and she had a special notebook for it.
I have great difficulties in my own poor temper, violent feelings, which tend to make one selfish.
In her private notebook, a distraught Victoria listed her failings as a woman and a wife.
Have I improved as much as I ought? I fear not. To my beloved and perfect husband, I fear also I have been a great trouble.
It's almost like she has become an extra child in the palace nursery.
She shows the notebook to Albert every now and then, and he responds either saying you've done very well, or perhaps more often, you need to show more control and you need to be a bit better.
Marks for good behaviour were just the beginning. As the years went by, Victoria grew ever more dependent on her domineering husband.
She calls him master, he calls her child. It's he who chooses the wallpaper. It's he who tells her what she ought to wear. And I have to say, in the last two instances, he should probably be shot for that, because her wallpaper was incredibly busy and her clothes did not flatter her. She could have probably done a better job herself.
As Albert's power grew, the once feisty Victoria seemed to fade from view. But as she became weaker, a shocking event was about to throw the country into chaos and test whether Victoria could still be Britain's queen. For decades, Victoria's growing empire had been in conflict with Russia. In 1853, tensions finally exploded in the Crimean War. Nearly 100,000 British troops fought in freezing, disease-ridden conditions.
Queen Victoria was constantly asking questions, whether the equipment was getting through, whether they were getting the medical attention they needed. She had a real feeling that they were her soldiers, they were fighting for her and for the country.
Victoria knew the well-born officers would be rewarded with medals and honours, but she wanted ordinary soldiers to be recognised too. So now, she gave her name to a military award that's still one of the highest honours for gallantry in the British Armed Forces.
This is the medal that was introduced, the Victoria Cross, following the Royal Warrant of January 1856, and it was awarded to all ranks for valour. Queen Victoria was very involved in the design of the medal, as was Prince Albert. Originally, it was suggested that that would say for bravery, but she crossed it out and replaced that with for valour, because otherwise it would suggest that other soldiers weren't brave.
Throughout the war, Victoria used medal ceremonies to forge a new bond with her people.
Many of the privates smiled, others hardly dared look up. All touched my hand. The first time that a simple private has touched the hand of his sovereign, and that, a queen.
She's meeting the men who have suffered terribly and who have carried out extreme acts of bravery in the middle of horrific atrocities. So the fact that she reacts to that with such understanding really shows us a very human side of her.
This was a new thing, that the Queen pinning the medal on a humble private onto his chest was something I don't think that previous generations would even have thought about. I think it was a turning point of what you expected from a monarch. I think it meant that the public felt that the Queen was closer to them as well as closer to her soldiers.
Victoria had been fading into the background, torn between being a mother and wife or a queen. With the war, she finally regained her confidence, realising she could play these different roles at the same time.
Journalists talk about her sympathy, her feeling, the sense that she's with our boys in the Crimea. Suddenly, Queen Victoria's sense of herself as a woman, instead of becoming something that has to be tidied away or explained or apologised for, becomes a kind of strength. And we have a sense now in which she's not simply the mother of her own biological children, she is the mother of the nation. That's a new kind of Victoria that we haven't seen before.
A year after her troops were victorious in the Crimea, the now 37-year-old mother of the nation had her 9th and final child. Beatrice soon became one of Victoria's favourites, but while she brought joy, the same couldn't be said for Victoria's eldest son. Bertie was becoming a teenage nightmare.
The expectation had been that Bertie would turn into another Albert. He'd been educated for that, and his education had been a complete failure. He was always smoking or drinking or being caught out. He seemed to be far too interested in girls, far too interested in fashion. You have a Prince of Wales who is essentially a playboy. He was just what the monarchy didn't need.
In the private notebook she used to list her own failings, Victoria now wrote scathing remarks about her own son.
His intellect, alas, is weak, which is not his fault. But what is his fault is his shocking laziness, which I fear has been far too much indulged. He seems in a sort of dreaminess, which alarms us for his brain.
By 16, Bertie's features were fully developed, but his mother wasn't impressed.
His nose and mouth are too enormous, and he pastes his hair down to his head. Handsome, I cannot think him. With that painfully small and narrow head, those immense features, and total want of chin.
I think the things that annoyed Victoria most about Bertie were all the things that reminded her of her young self. At one point she complains about him having a want of chin, to which you really want to say, well, just look at yourself, madam. The fact that he has a very bad temper, you feel like saying, hello, do you ever wonder where he got it from? There's also his huge appetites for food, for sex, which again you feel like saying, well, perhaps he got that from his mother.
The idea of Bertie inheriting her throne filled Victoria with dread, as she wrote in horror to her daughter.
I tremble at the thought. I try to shut my eyes to that terrible moment.
This is going to be disastrous for Britain. He is going to make a rotten ruler. It must have been absolutely terrifying for her to see that, to see, as it were, this car crash coming towards her.
Victoria believed that only a short, sharp shock could save Bertie from disaster.
I only hope he will meet with some severe lesson to shame him out of his ignorance and dullness.
Victoria didn't know it, but that severe lesson was on its way. Instead of saving Bertie, it would tear her own life to shreds.
Tự giật mình cũng được á. Tao nói rồi, khi nào tao ngủ ngon thì tao mới chúc ngủ ngon. Còn lâu tao mới ngủ ngon nha mày. Bớt chúc đi. Chúc ngủ ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Chúc ngủ ngon. Ngon, ngon, ngon. Chúc ngủ ngon. Chúc, chúc, chúc. Chúc ngủ ngon. Ngon, ngon, ngon. Chúc ngủ ngon. Chúc, chúc, chúc. Chúc
dù đâu. Sao hôm nay ta nỡ buông tay nhau về nhau? Sao yêu anh em hứa hẹn mãi sau? Sao tim ta đau, khoe mắt ai lâu? Liệu ngày sau niềm đau kia có phai màu? Buồn xuống còn nhiều điều muốn nói. Giờ đây đôi tim đã chia hai lối rồi. Hoài tiếc nuối về chuyện tình lỡ ta, để mình anh góc phố đêm về thơ than. Hôn xuân còn nhiều điều muốn nói. Giờ đây đôi tim đã.
By the age of 42, Queen Victoria had been on her throne for over 2 decades. The mother of 9 children, she'd finally won the love of her family and her nation. Yet she was about to face the most devastating year of her life, thanks to the antics of her eldest son. In the summer of 1861, Bertie went to train as an officer with the army in Ireland.
What the parents didn't realise was that Bertie's fellow officers had managed to smuggle into his bed one night a lady of the night, as they called her, who was known as Nellie Clifton.
Bertie spent 3 nights with Nellie. The gossip soon spread back to the palace.
Victoria is absolutely appalled to learn that Bertie has been set up with a prostitute. She thinks it's disgusting, it's awful, it's dirty.
She and Albert had worked so hard to raise the profile of the royal family, raise their popularity, to present this moral family to the world. And in 3 nights, he had simply undone that.
It was perfectly normal for a young man of Bertie's background and class to have sex with a prostitute. This was what happened at that time. What was not normal was the reaction of Prince Albert. Albert becomes almost sort of hysterical about this.
By now, Bertie had left Ireland to study in Cambridge. And it was here that a fateful meeting took place.
Albert goes to Cambridge, where Bertie was, and they have a long walk, and they come back having made it up. But it was absolutely pouring with rain, and Albert caught a chill, and that chill turned into an increasingly serious illness.
Albert returned to Windsor and took to his bed.
The doctors can't work out what the matter is with him. Is it typhoid? Is it, in fact, something that's long in the making? Some medical historians think that he may have had stomach cancer.
But whatever their private theories, the royal doctors didn't share them with Victoria.
Good, kind old Sir James Clark has been here since yesterday and reassured me, saying there was no cause for alarm, either present or future.
Nobody liked to tell Victoria because they knew how she would react, how upset she would be.
Soon, Albert's true condition was impossible to hide.
I went in at 7. He seemed to me a little incoherent. Went back to my room and felt as if my heart must break. May God help me and protect him.
Within days, Albert was suffering from a fever and experiencing hallucinations. Yet the doctors still reassured Victoria that all would be well.
Dr. Watson, whom I like and who is very kind, said he had seen many infinitely worse cases recover.
On the morning of the 14th of December, Victoria went in early as usual to be by Albert's side.
It was a bright morning, the sun just rising and shining brightly. Never can I forget how beautiful my darling looked lying there, with his face lit up by the rising sun, his eyes unusually bright, gazing as it were on unseen objects, and not taking notice of me.
The doctors told Victoria to go for a short walk. Minutes later, they called her back.
I took his dear left hand, which was already cold. All was over. I stood up and kissed his dear heavenly forehead and called out in a bitter and agonizing cry, "Oh, my dear darling," and then dropped on my knees.
They'd been inseparable for 20 years, but now Albert was dead.
After Albert had died, Victoria left the room where he died and she went up to the nursery where she collected up her youngest daughter, Beatrice, who was 4 years old, and carried her back to her own bed. And she then lay weeping next to Beatrice for the entire night.
This was the love of her life. This was a man upon whom she completely relied. This was her only friend.
Victoria was just 42 years old.
My life as I considered it is gone, past, closed. It is like death in life. Utter desolation, darkness, and loneliness.
It was the end of one of the greatest partnerships in British history, and perhaps the most important in modern royalty.
They reinvented this monarchy. They put this stamp on it of something people could look up to, something to respect, something that would last the years. And I think this saves the monarchy, because at a time when monarchies were toppling in Europe, the British monarchy survives. And the reason for this is Victoria and Albert.
Victoria had found a way to do what no Englishwoman had done before. She'd been a new mother, a wife, and a queen. But suddenly she was alone. Paralysed by grief, she doubted she could carry on.
It's like starting all over again, but without the buoyancy of youth, without the optimism of being a young woman. How is she going to manage this?
The thought of ruling without Albert was devastating to Victoria, but she had no choice. She had to go on, and she had to go on alone.
Victoria had to rediscover the confidence she'd shown as a young woman, with one difference. She'd given away power once, but she never would again.
No one person, may he be ever so good, is to lead or dictate to me.
Next time, Victoria's left a widow after the death of her beloved Albert.
She simply didn't want to be sovereign. She wanted to be alone.
She runs away from public life and leaves Britain without a queen.
MPs are openly saying it's time to wind the monarchy up.
But Victoria fights back to win power and the love of her people.
There's a sense in which the empire comes home, and it puts on an amazing show.
She suddenly realised that what she'd missed was huge crowds of people there for her and her alone.